Who was Brian?
Brian was handsome, kind, and smart. He was supportive, fun-loving, and always elevated the mood of others.
He was resilient and driven.
And he was frugal and loved to improvise.
Brian was an amazing brother. He and Mike were the torchbearers in our family, so in some way, I always looked up to the two of them. Brian inspired me to go into music for a little while. I remember when I was younger, one of Brian's friends called the radio a ghetto blaster, and I had to ask him what it meant. Brian and I just sat on the side of the curb and talked about ghetto blaster and types of music. That memory comes to me whenever I think of Brian.
Brian was born in between me and Steve, so I have plenty of fond memories teasing the two of them as the older brother growing up. I remember one time when we were playing outside in the yard, but it was about the time my dad would come home and check if we did our chores. Being the big brother, I had to be the one to be like, "Come on, it's time to go do our chores." But Brian, being hard-headed as always, said, "Don't put your hand on me." I thought nothing of it and put my hand on his shoulder to nudge him back inside with me. But he went and punched me in the face. I never told him this, but it really kind of knocked me out for a moment. Of course, when I came to, I punched him back harder. But that's a different story.
Oh, I have a lot of quarrel stories too. One time he placed a pillow over my head and was holding me down, as older brothers do. I was screaming, "I can't breathe." And then he said, "Well, if you can't breathe, why are you talking?" I remember thinking to myself, that kind of makes sense. But in reality, he was choking me and making me question myself.
Brian was like a little brother to me growing up, but we didn't experience any of that quarreling like Steve and Mike. My fondest memory of Brian was when we were in our 20s. We went to London and Paris to model. We were both with the same agency. We attended a go-see in a strange setting, so it was very anxiety-inducing. When I was standing in a sea of models, feeling intimidated and nervous, I looked across the room and saw Brian with his welcoming smile and being his charming self, and seeing him made me smile and soothed my anxieties. I met Brian in college during our freshman orientation, and I became attracted to his charisma because he was oddly confident for a freshman. I always remember Brian as someone who's always laughing and having fun. We used to dance together whenever he would come into town, just a bunch of us college friends. Those are some of the happiest memories I have.
The last major party we had together as a family was during our mom's 80th birthday party. He had a joke for every single person in our family. He was the life of the party at every party.
And he had a nickname for every person in our family. Mine was Sammy and Mike's was Crazy Horse. It's just the movie references that came in. He called us by those names all the time. He loved his family though. He always used to say, "I love my nieces to pieces" to my daughter.
By the time Brian was an adult, he was a jack of all trades. He worked as a human resources generalist, then a substitute teacher, and sometimes as a freelance writer. He wrote screenplays, modeled, acted, and was a stunt double for Will Smith. Brian was an avid runner and kept his body and mind healthy. He scrutinized anything that he put into his body. He was raised on the East Coast, but made the West Coast his home. Like many of us, he imagined that his adult years would be full of possibilities. However, all changed one day after one of his daily runs. When he came home and poured himself a glass of water, he started feeling a numbness in his leg. He thought nothing of it, but scheduled a checkup regardless. When he went in for the checkup, he was diagnosed with terminal disease, ALS. ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, is a progressive neurodegenerative disease that affects nerve cells in the brain and the spinal cord. Once ALS starts, it almost always progresses, eventually taking away the ability to walk, dress, write, speak, swallow, and even breathe, and shortening one's lifespan. The onset of ALS often involves muscle weakness or stiffness as early symptoms. Progression of weakness wasting, and paralysis of the muscles of the limbs and trunk, as well as those that control vital functions such as speech, swallowing, and breathing generally follows. ALS is typically a disease that involves a gradual onset. The initial symptoms of ALS can be quite varied in different people. One person may have trouble grasping a pen or lifting a coffee cup, while another person may experience a change in vocal pitch when speaking. Gradual onset of progressive muscle weakness, which is generally painless, is the most common initial symptom in ALS. ALS in 100% fatal. Progression is not always a straight line in an individual. It is not uncommon to have periods lasting weeks to months where there is very little or no loss of function. There are even very rare examples in which there is significant improvement and recovery of lost function. These ALS arrests and reversals are unfortunately usually transient. Less than 1% of people with ALS will have significant improvement in function lasting 12 months or longer. Every 90 minutes, someone is diagnosed with the disease and someone passes away from it. About 90% of ALS cases occur without family history, which is known as sporadic ALS. The remaining 10% of ALS cases are inherited through a mutated gene, which is known as familial ALS.
The diagnosis came as a shock, because last I had seen Brian, he was vibrant, active, and ran every day. He even modified his diet to keep optimal health. When I got the news that he was diagnosed with ALS, I didn't think someone so young could be diagnosed.
Most people who develop ALS are between the ages of 40 and 70, with an average age of 55 at the time of diagnosis. However, cases of the disease do occur in people in their 20s and 30s. What was thought to be muscle pains turned out to be a fatal diagnosis. That put a dent in all of Brian's plans.
After being diagnosed, he stayed with his mom, but within a couple of months, he had to be hospitalized because his illness took a turn for the worse.
Over the course of 2 years, Brian lost his muscle control, tone of his legs and torso. He returned to the East Coast paralyzed from his neck down. As an active athlete and lover of the outdoors, it was hard for him to be confined to a wheelchair in a local hospital. It was February. Brian was eager to leave the hospital and move to a home-like nursing facility with access to a deck and a view of the outdoors. 1 month after his transfer from the hospital to a nursing home, he was on lockdown as the world experienced the pandemic. Like many who are isolated in nursing homes, he could not go outside, nor could he see his family or friends frequently. He grappled with being alone and wrestled with his impending death, but still, he remained positive. He originally intended to move from his nursing home to a care center specifically for patients with ALS until he had recovered. Due to the pandemic, it became impossible for him to leave. Additionally, it was so hard for his family and friends to visit due to COVID regulations put into place.
Brian's diagnosis was hard for the family and his friends because he was such a creative, dynamic, young, and healthy person. After the COVID regulations went into place, family and friends weren't able to visit him as much as they had wanted. And even when they could visit, the physical distancing and protective barriers put in place strained the person-to-person connection. It really limited the support that his family was able to provide at that very difficult time.
COVID was terrible, but my brother had always been the kind of person who was determined and didn't lose his sense of humor or fun personality. That was also his Trinidad and South Carolina heritage. He was always so fun and full of life. He loved his family and those around him.
When I visited him in the hospital with some friends from his college, he always asked us to sneak food to him because he could not stand the food selection at the hospital. His favorite was chicken nuggets and mustard.
The diagnosis was difficult for him and complicated. There were times when he was determined to make it through. At times, we cried together. At times of immense spirit. But that determination was there the entire time. Part of the reason COVID was so difficult was because of all the restrictions put on visits and on physical distancing. The change of management at the nursing home did not help. Conditions seemed to deteriorate, and because Brian was outspoken in how he deserved to be treated, we feel the staff sometimes retaliated. Ever since the visits had to be cut down for the nursing facility to quarantine, I felt that Brian felt more down and isolated.
Because I live out of state, it was even more difficult for me to visit him. I tried to send him moral support electronically, but it didn't really feel like enough.
After his diagnosis, it was hard visiting him in the nursing home, both because of COVID and because it was difficult to see him in that state.
The ALS diagnosis is very hard because, unlike other illnesses, people with ALS are so cognitively aware of losing control of their bodies. It was devastating, especially with COVID. He longed to go outdoors so much that he would ask the nursing staff to take him outside alongside the smokers, just to be outside. Of course, I told him he shouldn't be out with the smokers, but he said he just wanted to have a bit more freedom. There were times when I could only visit Brian on the other side of a glass door, but I would always try to bring him encouragement letters, drawings and paintings that students had written and submitted to cheer him up.
I really commend the work of SGAP leaders and their Letters of Encouragement project because there was so much difficulty with COVID, and it was difficult to make sure residents and care systems have the support they need. SGAP leaders help fill in that additional support.
From our Letters of Encouragement project, Brian specifically favored the art submissions. He had them put on his wall so he could look at them all the time, and it helped him personalize his room. He was creative, so he loved the students' creativity.
I want to thank SGAP leaders for the encouragement letters because my mother and I didn't know if we were doing enough to support Brian at the time. But the extra support from the students definitely helped.
It was hard for Brian. He felt so isolated and locked down at the nursing facility during a pandemic. The things that kept him going were the brief moments he spent with friends and family and the drawings that he received from the letters of encouragement. When he received those encouragement letters from SGAP leaders, he told Michelle Joseph, the program's executive director and his good friend, that the students' words of encouragement helped so much. I recall him saying, "It's very easy to feel isolated in his situation, so those kinds words really helped."
The Letters of Encouragement project has recruited over 250 students to participate in sharing letters, poems, drawings, and stories of encouragement with senior residents at local nursing homes and assisted living facilities who have been affected by COVID. Right now, we have accumulated over 700 submissions and are serving 17 assisted living facilities, totaling up to over 1,200 residents. We are continuing to spread encouragement through this project and hope that more students will join us at sgapleaders.org/get-involved.
In addition to supporting SGAP Leaders' Letters of Encouragement project, please consider supporting ALS organizations to help those affected by ALS. You may make a donation to the local ALS chapter, the ALS Association DC MD VA chapter by mail or online with the link on the screen. Register and participate for one of our 6 Walk to Defeat ALS fundraisers or volunteer with the local chapter. There are a total of 38 chapters of the ALS Association focused on creating a world one day without ALS. Everyone needs encouragement. The gift of encouragement is healing for both the receiver as well as the giver.